I was asked to lead off this symposium on American tartans by laying some groundwork, talking about some general principles. So my talk is going to be a little bit more general than a lot of what you're going to hear this afternoon. So we'll get right into it. And oddly enough, if you want to begin a study of American tartans, you have to start not in Scotland per se. Ironically, we're going to start in London. And I'm going to begin by telling you about a society that was established in 1778 called the Highland Society of London. In many ways, it was a precursor to our St. Andrew's societies, our Caledonian clubs. It was a charitable group that was established to support schools in the Highlands and the northern parts of Great Britain, to relieve distressed Highlanders at a distance from their native homes, and to preserve the antiquities and rescue from oblivion all the valuable remains of Celtic literature, and generally to promote the improvement in the general welfare of Scotland. It was a kind of an expatriates club down there in London, and part of their activities in the early days involving the preservation of the tradition of Highland dress, most notably the tartan. The Highland Society was largely influential in the repeal of the Prescription Act in 1782. And can we see the first image up there, image 1? The Prescription Act was put in place after the failed uprising of 1745, part of which forbade the wearing of Highland dress and the tartan north of the Highland line at this stage. The first named tartans were likely military tartans woven for the regiments and fencible units that were raised in the Highlands during the 18th century. These regiments were typically very closely associated with one or more clans, and so the uniformed tartans worn by these regiments naturally became associated with the clans themselves. And so we have the Gordon Highlanders wearing the Gordon tartan. We can see image 2. There we are. The tartan there is worn by the Gordon Highlanders is worn today by the Gordon clan. Likewise, the tartan of the Seaforth Highlanders is now worn by the clan Mackenzie. The tartan worn by the Bailey Fencibles is now considered the Bailey family tartan. And the Campbells, Monroes, Grants, and Sutherlands all wear the tartan of the Black Watch Regiment. But in the early 19th century, the assumption by many was that this tradition of named clan tartans was extremely old. And the fact that so little was known about them at the time was chalked up to English suppression. So groups such as the Highland Society of London saw it as imperative that the remnants of this tradition be preserved before they were lost. And this was the driving force behind the tartan collection. But one problem was, many of the clan chiefs to whom they wrote requesting samples had no idea what their clan tartan was supposed to be. So it's true that in many cases we don't know the actual origin of a particular clan tartan as we do with the Gordons. But for some we do, and those stories are worth telling. I want to first look at the Robertson clan tartan. We can see the next image. The Robertson clan is called in Gaelic the Clan Donachie, and the chief of the clan, after he received his request from the Highland Society, went about Athol asking all the old men, "Do you remember what our clan tartan was? Do you remember?" And the interesting thing is, number one, many said, yes, we do. And number two, they all thought it was something different. Ultimately, the tartan that he submitted to London was the military tartan that was worn by the loyal Clan Donachie volunteers, which was a type of home guard. And it was raised only a few years earlier in 1803. That's the tartan you see here. It's a variation of the Black Watch tartan, which many military tartans are. And today it's worn by the Robertson clan as a hunting tartan. And the next tartan we'll look at on the next image, this began life as a fashion design by the prominent weaving firm William Wilson and Sons of Bannockburn. Wilsons opened their firm sometime before 1765, and they quickly became the major supplier of tartan cloth. They were operating in Bannockburn, which is outside of the Highland line, and so they could weave the cloth without being subject to the Prescription Act. And they became the major supplier for uniform cloth for the Highland regiments. Much of the early information that we have on 18th and 19th century tartan designs comes from their records. and it's assumed that many of the tartans collected by the Highland Society were actually woven by Wilson's. This is a photograph of a sample from one of their pattern books from around 1830. Now this particular design, Wilson's gave the very romantic name of number 43. Now at some point in their records, they decided to call it something a bit more romantic sounding than that. By the late 18th century, it had become fashionable to assign tartans names rather than numbers, and so eventually they came to call this Caledonia, which is the old Roman name for Scotland, a much more romantic name than number 43. But at some point, this same design was sold to a gentleman with the surname Kidd, K-I-D-D, and so in their records you'll see it referred to as number 43 or Kidd. Still later, it was sold to a gentleman named McPherson, who owned a sugarcane plantation in the West Indies, and he bought bolts of this stuff to outfit his slaves on his sugarcane plantations. And so when you buy enough, Mr. Kidd gets his name scratched out, Mr. McPherson gets his name written in. Right? So fast forward to the year 1815, and Duncan McPherson, the chief of the clan, receives his letter from the Highland Society of London. Please send a sample of your clan tartan. And he does what you or I might do if we were interested in knowing what our clan tartan was. He writes to the weavers, and he says, please send me a sample of the McPherson tartan. And they sent him number 43. And he affixed his seal, sent it to the Highland Society of London, and today this is still recognized as the McPherson clan tartan. We can see the next image. There you go. He's awful proud of that, number 43. So why am I going into all of this? What does this have to do with what we're talking about today? No matter the particular origin of the tartan, the Highland Society set a very important precedent in establishing a collection. They went straight to the chiefs of the clan and said, please tell us what you consider your clan tartan to be. Whether the tartan was old or new, whether it was worn by slaves or worn by soldiers, didn't matter. What mattered was simply this: was this tartan accepted by the clan chief? If yes, then it was recognized as a clan tartan. It's as simple as that. The chief had the prerogative to declare tartan a particular symbol of his clan. And at a time when clans were stripped of all significant military or political power, and clansmen were spread out to the four corners of the globe, the tartan became a very powerful symbol to unite Scotsmen across the oceans and across continents and recall to them their heritage that they had left behind in Scotland. Now, I must also point out that not all of the early tartans were clan tartans. We've already mentioned military tartans, worn by the regiments, often associated closely with the clans. But many of these early tartans were also named for places. We can see the next slide. These are what we would call district tartans, one of the oldest of which is the Aberdeen district tartan. We have a letter from Wilson's dating to 1794 which mentions this tartan. Other district tartans include Glasgow, Dundee, Crete. We can see those on the next image. Now, unlike the clan tartans, for which groups like the Highland Society of London sought out the approval of the chiefs, there does not seem to be any attempt early on to authenticate these so-called district tartans. The weavers would just assign the name of a place, maybe because the pattern sold particularly well there, maybe because the pattern originated from that place, and that was that. No attempt was made, for example, to get the authorities in Dundee to sign off on the Dundee tartan. And even in more recent examples of district tartans in Scotland, the same pattern often holds true. In the 1930s, we have the Galloway tartans designed by John Hannay. He designed a green hunting tartan, a red dress tartan. They're very popular, still woven today, worn very much. Never received any kind of official nod. One of the most popular district tartans in Scotland today, if you'll see the next slide, is the Isle of Skye tartan. Now, as popular as it is, it has no official authority behind it. So strictly speaking, we have to consider this a fashion tartan. It's a tartan named for the Isle of Skye, but it's not the Isle of Skye tartan. Some Scottish district tartans do have more of a claim of being official, and we'll see one in the next slide. The East Kilbride tartan was designed in 1990 by Dr. Gordon Teal, and it was specifically commissioned by the East Kilbride Development Corporation. There are a handful of other modern district tartans which seem to have been officially adopted or approved by the towns and cities for which they're named in Scotland, but by and large those are the minority. However, if we jump across the pond to North America, which brings us to the subject of today's symposium, we should not be surprised to find that the tradition of creating symbolic tartans followed the Scots wherever they settled. In the United States and in Canada, there has been a growing practice of creating tartans for cities, states, provinces, and other regions dating back to the 1950s. The other presenters on the panel today will talk about many of these specifically. I just want to give some general principles here. Perhaps because the designers and the promoters of these tartans find themselves far removed from their Scottish homeland, perhaps out of a desire to legitimize these tartan designs that have been created thousands of miles, in some instances, from Scotland, there has here been more of a focus on having an authority give official recognition to these North American tartans. Many in the past have mistakenly looked to Scotland for that authority. Many believe that the Lord Lion can legitimize a tartan by recognizing it. Lord Lion is the sovereign king of arms in Scotland, and he has jurisdiction over all matters of heraldry, but that jurisdiction does not extend to tartans, which are not, strictly speaking, heraldic. Many also look to groups such as the Scottish Tartans Authority, who maintain records of tartans to give official approval. Today, with the establishment of the National Tartan Register maintained by the Scottish government, people look to that for the same purpose. All of these above-mentioned organizations maintain records of tartans, but they're just that. They are a record of a tartan. They can give no legitimate approval to a design. And to put that in terms of familiar clan tartans, the Duke of Argyll, who is chief of the Clan Campbell, has the authority to say what is and is not a Campbell tartan. In the case of American state tartans, we would look for that tartan to have some official recognition by the state legislature. And if you think about it in those terms, there's already a system in place. Every state in the Union has official symbols of that state. And if you'll show the next slide here, I'm a Carolina boy. I was born and raised in North Carolina, and I hope never to live anywhere else. And we have official symbols of my state here. There's a North Carolina flag. Our state has an official bird, the cardinal. We have an official flower, the dogwood. Many of you, no doubt, could name official symbols of your home states. And that's what a tartan is. A tartan is a symbol. And therefore, it's up for the state to decide and recognize through official legislation what will be a symbol for that state. All of these things are listed out on the North Carolina Secretary of State website. And if you go to that website and look for a listing of North Carolina state symbols, you will find an official tartan. We can see that in the next screen. This is the Carolina tartan. It was first conceived of by Dr. Michael MacDonald. He was an anthropologist from Scotland, and James Kerr, vice president at the time of the North Carolina St. Andrews Society and president of the Kerr Family Association of the United States. They had met at the annual Grandfather Mountain Highland Games, which I hope many of you have had the opportunity to attend. And the idea was formed to create a special tartan to honor the contribution of Scottish immigrants to the Carolinas. Dr. MacDonald's son, Peter, is an accomplished tartan hand weaver. He's also currently serving as the chief researcher for the Scottish Tartans Authority in Crieff. And Peter MacDonald came up with this design for the Carolina tartan in 1981 based off an old sample of the Royal Stuart tartan, because the original land grant for the Carolinas was made by King Charles II, the last king of Scotland to be crowned at Scone. And it said that he wore ribbons of the royal tartan during his wedding. Now, we don't know really what tartan that was, but Peter MacDonald felt that it was appropriate to have the Carolina tartan reflect this royal heritage in some fashion. And so this tartan was accepted by the St. Andrews Society of North Carolina. It was later presented to and accepted by the St. Andrews Society of Charleston in South Carolina. And it was worn by the Cross Creek Pipes and Drums. You want to see the next slide here. They're the pipe band up top in their new kilts. They just recently had to retire their old Carolina kilts and had new ones made. It's also worn by the North Carolina State Pipes and Drums, which is pictured below them there. Various other Scottish heritage groups in the two states, including the Catawba Valley Scottish Society, also use the tartan quite a bit. So this shows that the tartan was accepted and used by various Scottish heritage organizations within the states, but official recognition came after the fact. On April 18th, in 1991, Senate Bill 713, which you would go to see the next slide, you can go online to the North Carolina government website and see Senate Bill 713, backing up there. The state of North Carolina formally adopted the Carolina tartan as the official tartan for the state of North Carolina. More than a decade later, on June 3rd in 2002, South Carolina would do the same with House Bill 5063, which you can see in the next slide. These images aren't quite as exciting as pipe bands and tartans, but they show that records do exist, and these records are important to show what tartan is and is not officially recognized by a state government. So there are examples, other examples of state tartans which have been formally recognized by their respective states very quickly. Sometimes the process takes years, if not decades. In some instances, like the Carolina tartan, it's been a matter of just giving official recognition to a tartan already in common use by the Scottish heritage groups within that state. In other cases, there may have been multiple tartans being promoted by different organizations, kind of vying for acceptance, and the official legislation is the deciding factor as to which tartan can legitimately be called the state tartan. And my fellow presenters this afternoon will be giving more information on some of the particular state tartans that they have been involved with. But the principle that I want to convey here is simply this. To be a legitimate state tartan, the tartan should have the approval of the state government. It's the same principle followed in 1815 by the Highland Society of London, seeking the authority of the clan chiefs to authenticate their tartan collection. There are many district tartans today in use which do not have this type of formal authority. Some are quite old, like the Aberdeen tartan you saw earlier. Some are new, and some of them have been created for American states. These should correctly be considered fashion tartans, as they have no recognized authority behind them. And I want to point out that in and of itself, the practice of creating fashion tartans is an old and respected one. However, a line is crossed when a fashion tartan pretends to be something that it's not. Or as a tartan can't really pretend to be anything, I should say, when it's presented by someone to be more than it is. No one should feel that he could create a new tartan, call it McDonald, and claim that it's an official McDonald clan tartan without the approval of the chief. Likewise, no one should claim any tartan to be the official tartan of a state without formal state approval. And I'll end by giving one example of a fashion tartan that I think does what a fashion tartan should do, one name for a state, and that's the final slide. This is called the Virginia tartan. Now, it was designed by a gentleman named Andrew Elliott, who owned a weaving firm in Selkirk, Scotland. Came to visit the United States. He was inspired by the beautiful colors of the Blue Ridge Mountains when he was traveling through Virginia. And so when he came home to his mill, he created this design. He called it Virginia. Now, he never sought official recognition from the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was created as a fashion design, just named for Virginia in honor of the beauty that inspired him in creating the tartan. And I'm sure Mr. Elliott would be very proud for any Virginian to wear it, but he never put the tartan forward as an official symbol of Virginia. There are other commercial interests out there who do make a practice of creating tartans, naming them for places, including U.S. states, and presenting them as official or authentic, when in fact they are not. Don't need to mention any of them in particular right now. I'm sure some of my presenters will mention a few. It's enough to state the principle. An official state tartan needs to be recognized by the state. Anything else is really a fashion tartan, which is fine, so long as you recognize what it is. So once you know what the criteria is, when you see a tartan, before you buy into it, say, okay, is this the real thing? Is this a tartan that has the formal approval of my state, or is it not? Our states all have government websites. They all maintain records of state emblems and state symbols. These records are all online. Easy enough thing to check. And that's the principle here.